I buried my wife yesterday. Will you marry me today? He declared to the pregnant school teacher. The schoolhouse in Pine Ridge was silent except for the creak of the floorboards beneath Noel Ward's heavy boots. The townsfolk whispered he had lost his mind. After all, his wife had only been buried yesterday. Yet here he stood, grief carved into every line of his face, the black of his mourning suit still smelling of fresh earth. Anna James, the school teacher, looked up from her desk. Her hand, resting on her rounded belly, trembled as she met his eyes. She had heard the cruel gossip about herself often enough, the widowed girl with child destined for ruin. Noel's voice broke the silence, low and raw but steady with desperation. I buried my wife yesterday. Will you marry me today? The words struck the air like a hammer. It was not a lover's plea, but a father's cry to save his children. His 3 little ones, Sarah, Thomas, and Mary, waited outside the door, their faces pale, terrified of being torn apart by the town's charity board. Noel had promised their mother he would never let them be separated, and this was the only way left. Anna's throat tightened. He explained in halting words. It was not romance he offered her, but a bargain, a roof, a name, and protection for her unborn child in exchange for her care and guidance over his children. A fair trade, he called it, though his eyes betrayed the storm of grief and shame behind them. Anna's heart pounded. To marry a man she barely knew so soon, under such circumstances, was unthinkable. Yet in his plea she saw more than despair. She saw dignity and a fierce love for his children, and in that moment the entire town would soon whisper of. She whispered back, yes. Anna James had not always imagined her life would narrow to a quiet schoolhouse on the edge of Pine Ridge. At 24, she was still young, but the loss of her husband in a mining accident had changed her forever. When the news came, she had only been married 6 months. 2 months later, she discovered she carried his child. The whispers followed her everywhere. Some pitied her, others scorned her. Yet Anna held her head high, kept teaching her lessons, and vowed that her child would enter the world with dignity, no matter the gossip. It was that steel hidden inside her gentle frame that had drawn the children to her, especially the Ward children. Sarah, only 9, had her mother's serious eyes. Thomas, 7, was full of restless questions, while little Mary, barely 4, clung to her siblings with fierce loyalty. They adored their teacher, often lingering long after lessons ended to hear one more story or song. Anna had become, unknowingly, a quiet anchor in their storm. Noel Ward, by contrast, was a man carved by hardship. At 36, his broad shoulders and weathered hands spoke of years bending to the land, coaxing wheat and corn from stubborn soil. He was not known for conversation. Neighbors said he carried silence like armor. But to those who had watched closely, Noel's devotion to his family had been his defining trait. Catherine, his late wife, had been frail for years, and Noel had worked himself raw to provide comfort. When she passed, the townsfolk shook their heads, murmuring that grief might break him at last. The threat from the town's charity board cut deeper than any shovel of grave dirt. They believed 3 young children could not be raised properly by a widower alone. To split them between different homes was for their good, they argued. But Noel remembered Catherine's last words. Promise me, Noel, promise me they'll never be parted. That vow, burning in his chest, drove him into the schoolhouse the day after her burial. His proposal to Anna was not reckless. It was the only path he saw left. In her, he saw a woman already marked by sorrow, yet still unbroken, still capable of kindness. She, too, was vulnerable, alone, expecting a child with no name to shield her from wagging tongues. Together, perhaps, they could stand where alone they would surely fall. Anna's acceptance had stunned even herself. She had not spoken from logic alone, but from instinct, perhaps even from the stirrings of her unborn child within her, as though urging her to grasp this chance. She had seen Noel's pain, the hollowness in his eyes, and recognized a mirror of her own. To bind her life to his was to step into uncertainty, but it was also to step away from isolation. And so, within 24 hours of death, life began again in the unlikeliest of ways. A grieving farmer and a pregnant teacher, neither seeking romance, bound together by necessity. The town called it scandal. The children called it salvation. And in the hush of that cold autumn morning, two strangers began the slow, fragile work of becoming a family. The wagon wheels creaked over the frost-hardened road as Noel drove Anna toward his farm. The morning sun spilled pale light across the prairie, touching the grasses with silver. Anna sat upright on the bench seat, one hand tucked protectively over her stomach, the other gripping the rough wool of her shawl. Noel's silence pressed against her like a weight. He kept his eyes fixed on the horses, his jaw set, his black coat, the same one he had worn to the funeral, fluttering in the wind. Neither spoke for a long time. The clop of hooves and the distant cry of crows filled the stillness. Anna wondered if she had been mad to agree. Was this really a family, or merely a pact sealed by desperation? She glanced sideways at Noel's profile, stern, tired, yet marked by something deeper than hardness. Beneath the shadows of grief, she saw the trace of a man clinging to a promise. The farm appeared at last, standing solitary against the open sky. The white paint on the farmhouse peeled in places, and the barn leaned tiredly after too many seasons of storms. Yet the fences were mended, the fields plowed, and smoke curled faintly from the chimney, a sign of a man who never surrendered his duties, no matter the cost. The children were waiting. Sarah stood with arms crossed, protective as a young matron, while Thomas hovered at her side, restless and uncertain. Little Mary clutched the hem of Sarah's dress, eyes wide. When Noel helped Anna down from the wagon, the children stared as though meeting a stranger trespassing upon sacred ground. "This is Anna," Noel said simply. "She is your mother now." The words fell heavy. Sarah's lips tightened, though she said nothing. Thomas shuffled, scuffing dirt with his boot. Mary blinked up at Anna, then half hid behind her sister's skirt. The silence was sharp, and Anna felt her cheeks burn. Yet instead of forcing herself upon them, she knelt in the dirt, meeting them at eye level. "I don't want to take your mother's place," she said gently, "but I will care for you. I will listen, and if you'll let me, I'll love you." Her voice trembled, but she meant every word. Mary's little hand slipped free from Sarah's dress and reached hesitantly toward Anna. Anna caught it in her own, pressing it softly. Sarah looked away, fighting tears, while Thomas, after a long pause, muttered, "Are you still going to make us do our sums?" Anna smiled through the ache in her chest. "Yes, I will, but I'll tell you stories after." That night was harder still. The house was thick with memory. Catherine's shawl draped over a chair, her sewing basket half filled, the faint scent of lavender clinging to the curtains. Anna moved through each room quietly, careful not to disturb what remained, yet needing to establish her presence. She cooked a simple stew, but Noel barely touched his bowl. The children ate in silence, though Mary nestled close to Anna as she hummed a lullaby before bed. Later, as Anna lay on the narrow bed Noel had hastily prepared for her in the spare room, she stared at the rafters and listened to the wind push against the house. Doubt whispered, was this marriage nothing more than survival? Could grief and duty ever give birth to affection? Yet, as she drifted toward sleep, she thought of Mary's small hand in hers, and for the first time since her husband's death, Anna felt she belonged somewhere. Meanwhile, in his own room, Noel sat by the darkened hearth, Catherine's photograph balanced in his hands. He whispered a promise to her memory that he had kept their children together, and then set the photograph back on the mantel. For the first time in days, he allowed his eyes to close. And though he and Anna were strangers bound by necessity, beneath the same roof, the slow, fragile work of weaving a family had begun. The days at Pine Ridge soon fell into a rhythm, though at first the rhythm was jagged and uncertain. The farmhouse, long ruled by Catherine's presence, now felt like a stage where grief and hope wrestled for dominance. Every chair, every quilt, every pot hanging by the stove carried her shadow. Anna moved carefully, never trying to erase Catherine's memory, only to add her own quiet touch beside it. She began with small things. She swept the kitchen floor until the boards gleamed, humming under her breath. She patched the children's shirts with neat stitches, humming the same tune she once sang in the schoolhouse. She baked bread with a crisp crust that filled the house with warmth, a smell that tugged at the children's curiosity. Sarah, proud and cautious, still clung fiercely to her mother's memory. When Anna brushed Mary's hair one morning, Sarah snapped, "Mama used to braid it tighter." Anna paused, handed the brush to Sarah, and said gently, "Then perhaps you can show me." It was a simple exchange, but the tension eased. For the first time, Sarah looked at Anna not as an intruder, but as someone willing to learn. Thomas tested her differently. He came in muddy from the fields, boots dripping, daring her to scold. Instead of anger, Anna handed him a rag and pointed to the footprints. "A man cleans the mess he makes," she said firmly. His grin faltered, then returned with grudging respect. That night, he asked if she knew how to whistle through a blade of grass, and when she showed genuine interest, his pride swelled. Little Mary was the first to yield completely. She followed Anna like a shadow, slipping her hand into hers whenever she thought no one noticed. At bedtime, Anna sat on the edge of the girl's bed and sang an old hymn, the same one she used to sing to her unborn child when fear of widowhood kept her awake at night. Mary's eyes grew heavy, and before drifting to sleep she whispered, "Good night, Mama." Anna's throat closed and tears slipped silently down her cheeks. She pressed a kiss to the girl's hair, accepting the name with reverence. Noel remained the hardest to reach. He worked long hours in the fields, shoulders bent beneath the weight of both labor and sorrow. At the table, he ate in silence, gaze fixed on his plate. But Anna noticed the small shifts. He left her the first slice of bread instead of taking it for himself. He mended a hinge on the door without her asking. One night, when she struggled to carry a pail of water, he wordlessly lifted it from her hands, his touch brief but steady. One evening, a storm swept across the plains, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney. The children huddled near the fire, frightened by the thunder. Anna drew them close, telling stories from the schoolhouse, fables of clever foxes and brave children who outwitted giants. Their laughter broke through the storm's roar. When she glanced up, she saw Noel standing in the doorway, watching. For the first time since Catherine's death, his lips curved into something that might have been the shadow of a smile. The days grew colder as autumn slipped into winter. Together they stacked wood, canned fruit, salted meat. Noel showed Anna how to split kindling, his big hands guiding hers on the axe handle. She laughed when the wood cracked unevenly, and he murmured, "Better than my first try." The words were few, but they carried a surprising gentleness. At night, after the children were asleep, Anna sat by the fire with her mending. Noel often joined her, sharpening tools or whittling wood. The silence between them softened into companionship. Once, when Anna pricked her finger, he handed her his handkerchief without looking up, as though the gesture were instinct. She pressed the cloth to her finger and whispered, "Thank you." He gave no reply, but the corner of his mouth twitched. The cabin itself began to change. Curtains were washed and rehung. A quilt Anna had pieced together from scraps now lay folded across the sofa. Flowers, wild asters, brittle from the cold but still bright, appeared in a jar on the kitchen table. Slowly, the house ceased to feel like a shrine to absence and became instead a place of living, breathing warmth. On a Sunday afternoon, Sarah surprised everyone. After church, where whispers still followed their family, Sarah took Anna's hand in front of the congregation as they walked out. The gesture was small but public, and Anna felt the weight of judgment lessen around her. Noel saw it too. Later that evening, as he tucked the children into bed, he paused in the hallway and said quietly to Anna, "They're better because of you." The words were simple, but they struck deeper than any declaration. For Anna, carrying the secret ache of her unborn child, they were a balm. For Noel, they were the first step toward admitting that what had begun as desperation was shifting into something sturdier, something almost like hope. And so, day by day, chore by chore, kindness by kindness, the fragile beginnings of a true marriage rooted themselves in the soil of necessity. The grief still lingered, but laughter had begun to find its way back into the farmhouse. Winter's first snow had not yet melted when the knock came at their door. Noel opened it to find Theodore Hammond, a man in a fine coat with polished boots, far too clean for Pine Ridge. His smile was smooth, his tone oily. "I'm here on behalf of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad," Hammond said, handing Noel a folded document. "Your late wife, Catherine Ward, signed a transfer 3 years ago. This land belongs to us. 30 days, then you're trespassers." Noel's face went pale. His hand shook as he scanned the paper. Catherine's signature stared back at him in black ink. She had sold their home, their farm, the ground that held generations of his family's labor. The children, curious, peeked from behind Anna's skirts. Noel turned his face away from them, but Anna saw the devastation written there. That night, by the fire, he confessed what Hammond's words had done to him. "She must have felt alone," Noel said hoarsely. "So lonely she thought selling the land was the only way. And I never saw it. I failed her, Anna." The guilt crushed him. He stopped eating. He moved through the chores like a man half dead. His eyes no longer lifted to meet hers. For Noel, the paper was proof that he had been a poor husband, unworthy of Catherine, and now unworthy of this new makeshift family. Anna refused to accept it. She laid the paper flat on the table and studied every line. Something pricked at her memory from her time teaching civics in the schoolhouse. "Noel," she said carefully, "where are the seals? The witnesses? A deed like this cannot be valid without them." But Noel shook his head. "Hammond has the company's lawyers. I'm just a farmer." Anna's determination only deepened. "Then we will find the law that speaks louder than his lawyers." It was a grueling journey to the county seat, snow biting at their faces, the children bundled in the wagon. At the clerk's office, Anna insisted on comparing the deed to official records. Hours of searching ended with her triumphant cry, "Here, this copy in the county ledger. It shows your land was never lawfully transferred. Hammond's deed is missing the required witnesses. It's a forgery." Relief flickered in Noel's eyes, but doubt still gnawed at him. What if the town believes him? What if the law favors money over truth? Back in Pine Ridge, Hammond worked to ensure exactly that. He whispered to townsfolk in the mercantile, hinting that Noel had conspired to cheat his own wife, that Catherine had grown desperate and betrayed because of him. Old gossip resurfaced. People looked sideways at Noel and Anna at Sunday service, muttering behind hymnals. Then came the blow that nearly broke them. One evening, Sarah returned home in tears. A girl at school had taunted her, saying her mother sold the farm because she couldn't bear her father's temper. Sarah repeated the words, her voice trembling, and Noel crumpled as though struck. Anna knelt before the child, her hands firm on Sarah's shoulders. "Your mother loved you. She loved this land. She would never abandon it or you. Remember that." Her eyes sought Noel's, willing him to see what she knew to be true. Catherine's signature was real, but the paper story was false. That night, as snow drifted against the windows, Anna spoke softly but fiercely to her husband. "Hammond feeds on your guilt, Noel, but guilt is not truth. The truth is in the law, and in the lives you tend here. You are not the man he paints you to be." Noel stared at her across the firelight. For the first time since Hammond's arrival, he reached out, covering her hand with his. His voice was gravel low. "Then we'll fight him, together." The decision bound them, not just in necessity, but in unity. The secret Hammond tried to wield as a weapon had instead forged something stronger between them, the beginning of trust, the spark of defiance. But Hammond was not finished, and Anna knew the battle for their home had only begun. The winter deepened, turning the valley into a white silence. But quiet was never safety. Hammond had been humiliated once when Anna uncovered the forged deed. He would not be humiliated again. It began with whispers, men in the saloon repeating Hammond's words. "Ward's land is as good as ours, one way or another." Then fences were cut, cattle driven off in the dark. Finally, one night, the terror came full force. Anna woke to the smell of smoke. Flames licked up the barn's walls, sparks flying against the black sky. She shook Noel awake. Together they rushed into the night, the children's frightened cries behind them. Hammond's hired men melted into the shadows, leaving destruction in their wake. Noel seized a bucket, but the fire roared too fiercely. "Save the stock!" he shouted, pulling open the barn doors. Horses screamed in panic. Anna, without hesitation, plunged into the smoke, her skirts catching embers as she led the animals out one by one. The last mare balked, and Anna, coughing, struck its flank with her bare hand until it bolted to safety. By dawn, The barn was nothing but smoldering timbers. Noel's eyes burned not from smoke, but from fury. He gripped his rifle. "I'll end this. Hammond won't steal from me again." Anna stepped into his path, her hair singed, her face streaked with soot, but her gaze steady. "If you go with vengeance, you'll give him what he wants. He wants the town to see you as dangerous, a man unfit to raise his children. Don't let him win that way." Her words struck deeper than any bullet. Noel's chest heaved, but slowly his grip loosened on the rifle. He turned instead toward the county seat. "Then we take the fight to the law." The following Sunday, the entire town gathered in the church, drawn by Hammond's boasts that the wards were finished. But as hymns faded, Noel and Anna rose. Anna held the forged deed aloft, her voice clear and unwavering. She detailed the missing seals, the false witnesses, the law broken. Then she laid before the congregation the county ledger itself, proof that the farm had never been sold. Murmurs swept the pews. Faces once cold toward them now looked ashamed. Hammond sneered, trying to drown her words with mockery. "And will you believe the grieving schoolteacher and the farmer too poor to buy proper ink? Or the men who build your future, the railroad?" It was Noel who answered. His voice carried like the crack of an axe through pine. "This land is ours. My wife and I built it, my children grew on it, and this woman," he placed his hand on Anna's shoulder, "has shown more courage and honesty than all Hammond's lies could bury. If you cannot see truth when it stands before you, then God help this town." From the back, Reverend Thompson stepped forward, holding his Bible. "The truth has been spoken, and I will stand with the wards." The tide broke. Neighbors rose one by one, men who had once doubted, women who had once whispered, until Hammond stood alone, his power crumbling. The showdown had ended not in blood, but in truth spoken aloud and believed. And for Noel and Anna, it was the first true victory of their new life together. The days after the church showdown were filled with a quiet amazement. The same neighbors who once whispered behind their backs now arrived at the farm with hammers, timber, and strong hands. Together they rebuilt the barn, plank by plank, as children carried nails and women brought pies and hot cider. Where suspicion had once stood, solidarity now took root. Inside the farmhouse, warmth returned. The smell of bread rose from the oven Anna tended, while Noel mended a chair near the fire. In the corner, Sarah read aloud to Mary, who leaned sleepily against her. Thomas whittled a toy horse from a scrap of wood. It was a picture of family, imperfect, patched together, but whole. That evening, when the children were tucked into bed, Noel and Anna sat before the fire. The crackle of the logs filled the silence. For the first time since Catherine's death, Noel allowed himself to breathe without guilt. He looked at Anna, her face softened by firelight, her hand resting gently on her rounded belly. "You saved us," he said quietly. Anna shook her head. "We saved each other." He reached for her hand, rough palm against gentle fingers, and held it as if anchoring himself. "This house was Catherine's once. Now, if you'll have it, it's yours. And so is my heart." Tears welled in Anna's eyes. She had married him from necessity, yet somewhere along the way, necessity had blossomed into something deeper. She squeezed his hand, her voice breaking. "Then let's call it home, together." The firelight glowed over them as they sat close, two souls who had once stood alone, now bound not by desperation, but by love. Outside, winter winds blew, but within, the home was safe. Stories like Noel and Anna's remind us that sometimes love is not born in the warmth of spring, but in the harshest winters of life. Out of grief, fear, and necessity, they built something far stronger than they ever expected. A home, a family, a love worth fighting for. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, cultures, and hearts. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? And if you still believe in second chances and love that heals, stay with us. The next story is waiting for you.